Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope everyone is safe and taking care. My name is Pranali Raut from Nürnberg, Massey, India, and I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you at the A.B.I.S Knowledge Summit. Asia's Broadcasting and Infotainment Show, or A.B.I.S, comprises of the Broadcast India Show, the SCAT India Trade Show, and the Content India Show. At the A.B.I.S Knowledge Summit, we look forward to bringing you engaging panel discussions, interesting fireside chats, and interactive product demos over the next 3 days.
Welcome to this virtual Broadcast India panel session. IBM's lined up a great panel today, the financial impact of storage. I'm Stan Moote, CTO of IBM, and I get to see a lot of cool technology and business trends within our industry. For those of you who do not know about IBM, we're the authoritative voice for the broadcast and media industry. IBM facilitates the all-important networking and interaction that shape and define the unique ecosystem of the broadcast and media industry. We ensure that our members are kept informed by providing them an infrastructure of services and facilities to encourage discussion and collaboration across the whole broadcast and media BAM supply chain, while working through our Global Engaged Partner Program that gives IBM a host of global customers and their opinions across all topics and technologies. As an example, IBM's put together the industry standard Technology and Trends Roadmap. This roadmap helps the industry people understand technology on both the business and technical sides by putting technologies and trends on the standard technology adoption curve. One broadcast executive told us he demanded that every one of his direct reports had this roadmap on their wall to assure they kept an open mind of all the industry aspects on every project they worked on. Anyone in the industry can download a copy of the IABM roadmap at theiabm.org under the Technology tab. While media companies have progressed their transition to IP and virtual supply chains, storage has become a hot topic, yet far too often ignored until a purchase rec or invoice shows up on the CFO's desk. So today, we're fortunate enough to have a great panel, each seasoned industry experts with a strategic understanding of workflows that necessitate storage. My goal on the panel today is to uncover the real costs of storage while covering asset-based workflows, hybrid workflows, and the thorny issues of cost versus performance, as well as security and reliability. So let's jump right in. We have Margaret Craig, CEO of Signiant. Margaret, tell us a little bit about Signiant and how storage fits in.
Sure. I think most listeners of this podcast are aware that Signiant software moves large data sets between storage repositories. So these days, that means that we need to connect to storage of all types. So we need to connect to on-prem object storage, on-prem file storage, and storage from various cloud vendors. So from a business perspective, we never resell storage, and so we don't really have a dog in the hunt, but more we act as a storage abstraction layer and make sure that our customers can connect to all of those different kinds of storage. So one of those things that does give us is a lot of insight delivering via a fully instrumented SaaS these days.
Great. And Matt's a specialist solution architect at AWS. And in a nutshell, obviously, everyone knows what AWS is. So what's the biggest storage misconception you run into in helping out customers?
So thanks for having me, Stan. So it's really interesting when we start talking about storage and cloud. Some of the misconceptions that really come into play is I have to completely change my workload. It's not going to stay the same. I have to rebuild from scratch. And what I would say is it's not true. We have block, object, and file. They're all viable, and it really depends on what you're trying to do today in order to really get to that outcome.
Got it. Okay, so Brad, you're president of Trackit. A lot of people probably don't know about Trackit.
Appreciate it, Stan. So Trackit's a software development and consulting company, and most of our business revolves around media workflows. And we also have a very, very long history in storage. I think I started selling storage solutions to nonlinear editing in 1993 or 1994, so right at the beginning. We do help people decide what kind of storage is the best for their use case, as well as implement hybrid workflows in many cases, which is really where the tough part of storage comes in, especially when you're looking at multi-cloud, multiple on-premise locations. So our business is really helping customers use storage as well as the rest of the technology stack for their cloud-based or hybrid-based workflows.
Tom, you're CTO at M&E at Dell Technologies. Tom lives actually near me, and I pinged him last month for a brainstorming outdoor patio lunch, seeing as we've been locked down forever, it seems. Thought better do that before we get locked down again. Anyway, this topic came up, hence the panel. So Tom, tell us, what Dell Isilon customers are asking about.
For the last 15 years, having an on-prem scale-out NAS like Isilon was enough for most facilities. Now, between geographically distributed collaborative productions and work from home, whether for COVID or geographic desirability of talent, the whole workflow has changed. And so Dell, of course, is known for on-prem enterprise IT infrastructure, such as Isilon and ECS, our object store. But our customers are looking to implement a hybrid workflow so that they can use the cloud, whether it's a private or a public cloud, using cloud or object storage for what it's good for. And certain workloads still, it may change in 10 years, but right now, certain workloads, the high throughput, low latency kinds, those still belong on-prem. And so, as Margaret said, managing the data between cloud that gives you a geographically distributed namespace and on-prem for those, really direct workloads, that's what most of our customers are trying to implement these days. And data management becomes the central focus of what they're going to implement.
Well, certainly we will get into data management. Brad, you do managed services, consulting on cloud and infrastructure. So what are your thoughts on-prem, off-prem, hybrid?
So there's that, as well as the right storage for the job as well. So I think Margaret touched on it a little bit earlier. There's all sorts of different flavors of storage, block, object, file systems, and then where you put them and how they're accessed. So the biggest part and the biggest challenge anywhere you have big data or big content is making sure that the content is where you need it, when you need it, and has sufficient performance parameters for whatever you're going to use it for. So it really is the trick, and it really is, I think, the final frontier in hybrid workflows, and frankly has been even in multi-site on-prem environments. We've had studios and post-production companies that were in Los Angeles, London, and who knows where else, always with a data problem. It's just exacerbated when you have cloud in the mix as well now. So I think that the first place to start is to really understand what the workflow requirements look like. And that's not only the performance aspects of it, but the business part of the problem. Where are you going to be able to do a job that, one, it can get done in the time frame it needs to get done in by the people or personnel that need to have that content. So I think that's really the starting point, and it's a journey. It's a continuing journey, really. And there is tools starting to happen. Signiant is one of the companies that's, I think, been trying to do some of these things for many years. But there's a long way to go, and it's really where our company fits in to try and paste together the correct solutions to get the data where it needs to be, when it needs to be there, with the right SLAs so it can meet the application needs.
Oh, Margaret, that's a great segue over to you on your thoughts on on-prem, off-prem, and hybrid.
Yeah, when I talk to our customers, one of the things I would observe on this front is that there is kind of a disconnect between the strategic view of our media customers and what's happening on the ground. So I would say that at the senior levels within the media companies, almost everybody would tell you that they're committed to a hybrid cloud, multi-cloud approach to storage. Just as Tom was saying, they're not going to move it all to the cloud. They're not going to keep it all on-prem. So they'll tell you strategically, that's where we need to go. We need to hedge our bets. We need to have the optionality of using different storage types. However, on the ground, it might be that day to day, when people are implementing workflows in the heat of battle, it will still be that most of it will go to Amazon if it's cloud, or into an existing on-prem data infrastructure.
Makes sense. I just want to back up before I get on to the next topic here. Brad, maybe you just want to explain to people what object storage is, because it's a confusing issue with a lot of people.
It is. And everybody is familiar with what a file system is, whether it's on your computer itself, where you see a directory structure with your files in there, or whether it's an external file services application like a NAS. And historically, these are what applications look for. Hey, give me a POSIX, which is the name of what this hierarchical file system structure is. Give me a directory and a file, and I can go point my application at it. Object is a little different. Object is what is known as an object store, is where you have what are really immutable objects that are sitting someplace. You can kind of think of it as FTP on steroids. You put a file someplace, and if you want to change it, you really can't. You have to write a new file. Now, maybe some of the object stores mask that, but it's really a place where you put things in and you take things out. And unfortunately, most of the applications that are available today can't use it natively. So Premiere can't use it natively. Avid can't use it natively. You actually have to take that object, pull it into a file system, either local on your own disk drive or on a NAS or SAN file system kind of environment, and then you can work on it. So what we're seeing, and there's definitely a movement, especially if you're building cloud native software, which I think a lot of the software developers are finally starting to wake up to, is that, hey, I should be able to use that object store as my direct access storage environment rather than have to use sort of an old line POSIX environment like a file system. So these are some of the considerations that you definitely have when you look at what the storage environment looks like, and especially when you go to cloud, because really object is the native and basic storage domain in all the clouds today.
Well, let's jump over. Yeah, appreciate that. Let's jump over to Matt then. And cloud storage, obviously, it does seem simple, but people do worry and they consider it risky. As it's complex, it's multifaceted, and just like we're talking about, it does get a little bit confusing. So clearly, depending on the operators understanding, how best you teach people about the risk and the advantages.
Yeah, so when we start talking about cloud and moving your storage or kind of transforming your workload, I always say let's just stop for a second and actually understand what you're trying to accomplish. Is this an editorial workload? Is this archive? Is it distribution of all your assets? Because that really helps limit down what the function is you're trying to approach. Like if we're talking about an archive system, if we're looking at it from a traditional sense, you usually have tape vaults and you have tapes in your location. You usually have a second location that you're replicating or having some type of business continuity. And then you start going, I need my overhead man count or human count. I have my asset term, how long they last. And then you start looking at, okay, now I need to start doing fix the year checks or progressive checking on those assets. When you start shifting that ideation to cloud, you start having to remove those layers of concern of management. I don't have to worry about tape libraries. I don't have to worry about the media. That's kind of the advantage of moving to the cloud, getting 11 nines of durability, at least 3 distributed copies in a region. So, there's the risk is more of a lack of education along this path. And that's really great that people want to invest. And what I always say is that, you can always read white papers, you can go to classes. I would say get hands-on. There is an AWS free tier where you can start playing and be able to place these assets. You can work with your account teams. But once you get more hands-on, I think a lot of that fear factor quickly disappears because you're able to execute.
Yeah, Makes sense. Makes sense. All right. So, Tom, from your Technicolor days, you were big into production, and certainly, files keep growing and growing and never stop growing. So, can you jump into some of the workflow and cost issues?
Well, as others have said, the advantage of an object store is infinite scale and immutability. So things like, camera cards that are coming into the post facility from on set. As Matt said, those used to have to go to the SAN, and then they were backed up on LTO, and then we would use Signiant to transfer proxies down to the studio for dailies, and we would also use Signiant to send, again, proxies over to the VFX house. But the advantage of these globally distributed workflows is that Camera Raw goes up into the cloud and stays there. And that's really one of the points brought out in the Movie Labs vision paper. But it also is a kind of a general rule for how to deal with distributed storage. Instead of a whole bunch of point-to-point video lines, essentially, you can have a master namespace in the public cloud or private cloud or whatever you want. And then using intelligent data management, you can figure out what has to come down for somebody to work on. But you don't need to back that up because you know where it is. It's already up in the cloud, and it's never going to change. So the ability to have that distributed core that gives you a single namespace and smart data management to move some bits down to the hot edge for those kind of workloads. And as well, I know we're not focusing on security in this, but the third leg of that triangle is the protected backup.
Well, we will cover a little bit about security, but you just stimulated a question that just came in on the chat here. So how do you know where storage is? I mean, obviously there's sovereignty issues and things like that. So it's up in the cloud, but you need to know where it is.
That's the number one question facing everybody that's trying to implement these distributed workflows is, what have I got? What tier is it on? How much is it costing me to keep it on that tier? And what am I going to do with it? You need a data management solution that will answer those questions, or else it's back to the old days of an angry person running around with a clipboard going, "Where's that file?"
Well, we'll come in and we'll ask Matt that question in a second. Before we do that, let's Margaret, you've been sending a lot of stuff up into the cloud for ages. So do people ask you where it is?
Well, certainly, to Tom's point, we have to provide a bunch of tools that help them understand where it is. And we are being pulled to create more and more ease of use kinds of things to let people, for example, play an asset before they pull it down from the cloud to confirm that it's the right one. Partial restore from the cloud. So those kinds of functionality we now need to build into our software stack.
Makes sense. So Matt, what about the data sovereignty issues then?
Data sovereignty is such an interesting point of view when you start talking about like GDPR and California's Protection Act and all these different ones that start really coming out, and especially across the European Union and nations, to be able to say, I had data originated from here, it needs to live here, it needs to stay here. So when we start thinking about that from a technical abstract, we think about locality. So what region or location is it in? And that's embedded into like S3 URLs. That way you identify the bucket, the location, the identification of the asset. But, to Tom's point, data moves constantly from camera card out to DIT station, up to the cloud, to editorial. And you might be using a partner along that space, and that partner might be in the UK. What I think is an interesting shift in this really whole pendulum, so to say, is that your talent doesn't need to be at your shoot location. It doesn't need to be directly in your studio. You can have your talent distributed globally and give them unique resources to connect to. So it almost bring it back to, Margaret's point of, advancing the tool set to gain partial file restore and more auditability along the path. And even down to, kind of the group's point of saying, there's more to come. We need better data management. We can definitely identify where data is. We can identify assets as they live today. But I think the thing that's lacking, and really the tool set that needs to really just come to fruition, is adaptive location analysis and data movement transparency. And that is going to be event driven or even project driven. And it can be done a million different ways, but maybe the unification of that falling even into the point of the Movie Lab's 2030 vision, unification of APIs. Maybe that's really the next iteration where we need to all drive towards.
Well, I probably should ask Brad this next question, given all the guitars on your wall there, but I'm going to swing over to Matt for a second. Just tell me about audio in the cloud. That has been a real issue.
Yeah, to the point of not everything is perfect everywhere in the world, the cloud and audio are kind of an interesting mix. If you're going to be using stereo mix, it makes a lot of sense. When you start getting into 7.1, 8.1, 100 channels of audio, the cloud has limitations in the fact that you have to use a streaming provider. And streaming providers out there today, like Teradici, Nice DCV, all have audio limits that they can stream back to your local workstation. So, if you really need to start mixing hundreds of channels and live playback and specialty Dolby Atmos and all these elements, the cloud can help facilitate that, but I don't necessarily think it's the right place right now today. Now, as technology progresses and changes, this story will change. And I think it's really exciting. And I personally, I'm a huge fan of audio mix and edit. So it's something that we're heavily investing in.
Yeah, and I guess that's latencies are a whole other story when we get down to audio stuff. We won't get into that. That's a whole REMI production issue and things like that. But I do want to have Tom jump in here. The cost issue of when we talked about SSDs and 3D NAND was the big savior. Cost was going to be there, everything, it was going to be cheap. So what's the deal now?
Before I answer that, I just want to add one more thing to what Matt was saying, in that if you're actually in a room that is an audio environment tuned for Dolby Atmos to mix 22.2 or something like that, you've already spent $2 million maybe on the mixing theater. And so the advantage of just having a cache, if you will, of local direct attach for your Pro Tools stubs is minuscule compared to the cost of building an actual audio environment. And that's when we're talking about costs, we get very tunnel vision sometimes about zeroing in on a particular cost removal without realizing that labor, artist talent, is usually the biggest cost in any kind of M&E production anywhere. But now switch gears down to the component level, if you will, talking about hardware prices, because we've all heard about these component shortages due to COVID exposing the gaps in our global supply chain, right? And so I forget who it was talking about all the different various tiers of storage. The same thing exists at the component level, where I guess it was maybe 15 years ago, the cost for a single bit of non-volatile memory became cheaper than regular RAM, right? You know that DRAM is super fast, but it loses its contents when the power goes off. All of these non-volatile RAM components mean that we have opened up a completely new class of, or a completely new paradigm called storage class memory. But anyway, 15 years ago, we saw, remember like SD cards that used to go in your camera? And then that just became a complete race between improvements in flash density from like SD cards. As soon as it became, more than a floppy, boom, floppies are gone, CDs are gone. But it's a race between density, how many bits can you pack, per square millimeter of silicon. But actually the bus protocols, or the access protocols, are more important, because it was first USB drives, and then we had iSCSI, we had SATA interfaces, SAS interfaces, and now the current champ is NVMe, non-volatile memory express, because it plugs right into the PCI bus using 3 lanes of bus. So there's your the top of the peak right now in terms of cost per density is an NVRAM attached, directly to the PCIe bus. But there's so much more coming. There's active development on like phase change RAM, resistive RAM, carbon nanotubes. But again, these things all come at a cost. Like right now, if I was to buy a new Intel CPU that uses the Ruby, or whatever the one after Ice Lake is, I would have to buy DDR5 RAM for that, which is great because it's super fast, 4.8 gigahertz, I think, is the clock speed. And yet 32 gig costs you $500 US. So obviously, as these components come in and out of favor, people invest in these billion-dollar fabs. And that's why 3D NAND is so good right now, is because Intel and Micron invested the billions of dollars 5 years ago in order to make 3D NAND ubiquitous. But other than adding more density to it, right now they're at 96 layers, and I think they're trying for 256 layers. So 3D NAND is going to be there for a while, but every increase in density bumps the cost by 2x, which is scary sometimes when you're designing a cutting edge system.
Yeah, you're getting into the curves and where they fit at that point in time. All right, so Brad, when you're talking to people and you're consulting and helping them make all these decisions, do they start with the final deliverable, or do they just dive in and say, I need storage?
Well, first, if it starts out with what the conversation we were just having was, type of memory, and the first thing I say is forget it, because that's been going on for at least 30 years in the storage business, where there used to be rotating disk and that was it, and now there's 17 different types of memory storage devices, and that's going to continue. So really, at the end of the day, what's important is, okay, what's your workload? And tell me what your workflow is. And that's the place to start. So you can't start at the storage. Starting at the storage, unless it's strictly for a backup or archive, it's really not where you start. It's tell me about your workloads and the workflow. And then we say, okay, we can start to dive in and say, well, what type of storage is correct? For example, if it is an archive workflow, well, let's take a look at an object kind of based workflow. If it's real-time, latency-sensitive media, something different. Do we look at some sort of NAS architecture? Do we look at a SAN-style architecture? Or do we look at something that's strictly local disk-based? So you really have to start at the top. Take a step back, take a deep breath. Let's look at the workflows, let's look at the workload, and start architecting from there. Now, that could be a pretty long discussion, because it could be pretty complicated. You could not only have a creative workload, but then you have file transfers in and out. You might have backup tasks going at the same time. You might have synchronizations with other things. So it is quite of an in-depth discussion, but you need to start at the top and then work your way down, and definitely not the other way around.
So do people ask you about multi-vendors, redundancy, those types of questions? Or do they just
They absolutely do.
want to get the job done?
No, that's a great question, and here's where I'm sure we might differ in the panel a little bit. I'm really a believer in picking a horse and riding it. The problem, for example, with multi-cloud or even multiple storage vendors is that if you have to support everything, you're going to be designing and building to the lowest common denominator. And that effectively means that somebody else who bets on the right horse is going to have a competitive advantage, because they're just going to be able to do things better. So if I'm going to go to AWS, I can use all the best AWS tools and services and design to AWS. I guarantee you I'll build better application environments than somebody who says I'm going to have my applications run across GCP, Azure, and AWS. It's just the way it is. And it kind of reminds me of back in the day when I'm just going to be an Avid shop. Oh, maybe I better hedge my bets and be an Avid shop and a Final Cut shop and a Final Cut shop and a Premiere shop. Or I'm going to have, 3 different storage vendors in my network. Oh, but then I'm going to have to remember that this storage is better for this, and maybe I have to remember that that storage is better for that. Oops, I ran out of space here. What am I going to do over there? So, yeah, multi-cloud, I get it. But if you're going to go multi-cloud, I would say try and divide along the lines of workloads versus applications themselves. Take a certain application set and run it one place or another.
Yeah, we went through that whole aspect with people moving over to IP in 2110. All of a sudden, they wanted to have two different types of routers for those reasons, for various reasons. But, I'm going to jump right onto Matt here. So, I asked the redundancy question because of outages. Go ahead. Tell me about outages.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about traditional senses of having data centers on site and somebody walks up and pulls that cable out and then all of a sudden the whole data center goes down, or you have a switch that goes down, building and designing for redundancy and scale is really what AWS strives for. So we have, over 25 geographic regions, over, I think, 65 availability zones. And really these services are designed to be able to scale and be able to be extremely durable. And let's just be honest, hardware fails, software eventually works. A mentor once told me that, and I always laughed about that through my career at various companies of just sometimes you have a problem. Within that same scope, though, I always advocate for designing for that event, right? Be highly available. And that's no different than being on premises today. You don't want to be locked into a certain architecture that has a core dependency on one pivotal piece that might fail. Designed to be highly available, designed to be distributed. And within the scope of AWS, there have been outages, and that's true. So we have a status page. We also do post-mortems in order to understand and to better the service to make sure that doesn't happen again. And, I think successfully AWS has been sustained online and available across its history and usefulness.
All right. So, Margaret, can you really move between cloud vendors then?
That's an excellent question. I think that it really does come down to, as was noted earlier, you don't want to take the same workflow or workload and move it from Amazon on Tuesday to Microsoft on Thursday. So we don't see that very much. And we don't see all of the costs going into making an individual workflow completely portable. So it's much more, we see our customers thinking about, for this asset class, which of the cloud vendors makes most sense? If this is a workload that I need to use a certain kind of AI or ML service, which of the clouds is best suited to that? So it's more of a mix and match than assume that you can move something, an individual workload, around between the clouds.
Yeah, makes sense. And as Brad says, pick a horse and move on. But when you're picking a horse, ultimately usually you pick two vendors or three vendors and you start playing the cost up against each other and things like that. And that's a whole different story. I don't care who wants to jump in on this question, but some of the costs that get ignored is, how do I get my data up into the cloud and how do I get it back? And they can be very costly. Who wants to jump in on that?
I'll just add that managing those egress costs in a multi-cloud environment effectively means that you have 2 or 3 edge environments. And managing 3 edges with different parts of each edge coming to me on-prem and having to go back up, that just makes the problem n-dimensional.
So, Matt, if you're doing an archive, can you afford, it costs you to get them up and down?
Yeah. So if we're looking specifically at archive, to put data in AWS is free, to post it into AWS. And you're going to post it in very, very affordable, durable storage called Amazon S3 Glacier or Glacier Deep Archive. And the idea is that you're not going to be touching those assets very much because it is an archive. There is a cost to recall, and that's very obvious. And there's a cost of data transfer out back down. So most of our customers have that understanding. We build pricing plans to go along with that so they understand their workflow. So this goes back to the point that Margaret made and a few others on the panel talking about understanding your workflow. Are you going to grab all of your data and shift it to Microsoft from a Tuesday to a Wednesday? Maybe, but why? Why is the question? Forget the vendors aside. What makes sense for the business and what's the outcome you're really willing to drive towards? Because in the end of the day, you're staking your business, your personal, professional, really reputation on the line to say, I'm going to pick a direction, I'm going to pick a technology. And this is really where I would almost transition over to Brad to ask is, when you make these architectural choices, what feels the most important to you to make sure that you're making those right choices? Especially if you're doing a complete re-architecture, if you're picking a certain specific business component that you need to achieve, or is it just hey, I'm shutting down these buildings and I need to move today, and I need to go quick?
That's really good. I mean, from an architectural motion is kind of the way I like to term it. When you're deciding to do something, the whole overarching architecture that you look at has to include things like, what's it going to mean for my business? What's going to mean for my business from a competitive standpoint? Am I going to be better at my competition or not? Is it going to accelerate what I can do? Is it going to provide me better scalability? And certainly at the very start, what is this going to mean for my cost structures? And it's part of the architectural journey as you start to build these environments. And the total cost of ownership or the return on investment, this is not a new concept. I mean, Tom, coming from the hardware business, been doing it for years, but I don't think people are doing it well enough or prescriptively enough, where now the environment is a little more difficult and has different knobs you can twist, like egress costs, for example. So I think it's something that needs to be recognized up front and built into the overall TCO and ROI of anything you decide to do. So it's a real business approach to it, but it's something that could help ensure you're successful in a business sense in the long term.
Margaret, you put together a great manifesto white paper on SaaS, and I remember when we were talking about that as well as some other things, and you were looking at some of the cloud providers' invoices, and you said there were hundreds and hundreds of line items. Do people really understand those costs? Brad's not, is it? Do people understand those costs?
Well, I think that's one of the ongoing challenges with the cloud is just, it's great that there's granular level of purchases that you can make. The challenge is looking at those and figuring out how to manage them. So I know there are a lot of emerging tools, both from vendors like Amazon and third parties for managing those. We use a lot of those tools ourselves, but that does remain one of the big things that I see our customers working through is just how do they, once deployed, how do they get a handle on the ongoing costs and the direction that those costs are moving from month to month and quarter to quarter?
What's funny is nothing ever changes. In the media business, it's always been about metadata, and in best practices, especially in the cloud world, there's these things called tags. And if you have the institutional fortitude to actually enforce a tagging practice that's well thought out, you can come back and do an easy report. It doesn't matter if there's 400 lines on your bill. You can say, oh, those 400 lines were attached to this project. And it's a part of the best practices to actually, when you go off and do that.
Yeah, Brad, I mean, you're hitting on a key component. No, it just really got me excited. Tagging, the identification of metadata around your projects is nothing new. It's really about execution. And this is maybe a tectonic shift of the way business needs to be operated, is really dive into making sure that there's identification of episode or show or vendor, who it is, and you can add multiple tags along this path in order to build backs within your own business unit. I mean, I would almost challenge the idea of saying, okay, you bought, and not to pick on anything specific, you spent $2 million on a storage system. Great. You bought it and you're going to have a useful life of X amount of years. Well, during that time of use and sitting there, it's not 100% used that entire time. So is that money well spent? Is it not money well spent? Because using what you consume versus planning for longer capacity term, it's just a different business mentality. But what I would say, and this is really where things get exciting, is, we're past the 15-year ago lock into technology where you bought X and it can never be upgraded. You can never change it. Now there's controller swaps, expansion cards, availability of upgrade or hybrid mentality of being able to shift data left and right or up and down. And that's where we have really great tooling and Dell and Signiant and all across the board. And this is really where it gets exciting, because you don't have to necessarily make a definitive choice today. you can adapt and change based on your business needs.
Fair enough. So I did want to bring up security quickly. We've also got a couple of questions here, so we'll have to be pretty quick. I always nag people though, because when we look at the IABM research and where people have things on their roadmaps and their spends, security's low down on the list, and it's not really considered within the supply chain enough. So I'll just let Margaret jump in here for a minute, and then I'm going to get on to a couple other quick questions.
Sure. Security, I think, remains a big concern for our customers. It's a big part of our value proposition. So we have a lot of detailed conversations. But what I'd note is people are more focused these days on looking at security holistically. 5 years ago, they would say, oh, I'm concerned about security of putting assets in the cloud. That isn't really a thing anymore. They're looking at it end-to-end, holistically, involving all of the people and systems that touch their content.
Yeah, so we do need to encourage more people to keep an eye on that. So let's look. One of the questions was on egress cost, exactly what it was, but I don't want to get into that. But I think people, you covered a fair bit of that, Matt. But one of the things we should talk about is future, and one of the questions came up is, what does the future look like in terms of data centers and environmental impact?
So, that's a really interesting transition, because we're moving from a business state to sustainability, right? Going into fully natural generated electricity, being eco-friendly, because let's just be honest, there's going to be generations after us, and we have to prepare for that and give the best, resources availability, and really position ourselves well to not destroy this beautiful planet that we're on today. And I think every company has a climate pledge. I know they all have energy pledges, and I think that's a really important first step, but there's always going to be the next step. And what would happen next would be starting to really give back to those communities. There's been the ideation of like the perfect designed data center, the perfect designed city. Is that the right option? Maybe. I'd be curious to hear what the other panelists think.
I'd like to add that data center computing is inherently more efficient because of the quality of power supplies and power conversion. If I had 300 random servers here with good or intermediate power supplies, I still wouldn't be using electricity as efficiently as I can in a proper 3-phase rectified data center. So I think that when we do put our computing workloads into a data center, it's much better than having to rely on a hodgepodge of power and HVAC that you can't control as well as you can in the data center. That's just my 2 cents.
I think it all comes down to infrastructure. And in this case, infrastructure means the network. So the availability of high performance internet and network connections allows you to do things that have big impacts on efficiency and overall costs, as well as space and these other things. So I wouldn't see any reason today why somebody would have a data center in their offices anymore. As Tom said, put in a data center where the overall costs are going to be cheaper and probably better for the environment as well. So it's really incumbent on us to continue to improve the overall network so people can get to the compute and the storage in places where it makes a lot more sense than to keep it in a back closet somewhere.
We covered a lot of ground today, and on behalf of Broadcast India, I'd like to thank all my panelists today. Margaret Craig, CEO of Signiant, Matt Herson from AWS, Brad Winett, President of Trackit, and Thomas Burns, CTO M&E at Dell Technologies. Again, I'm Stan Moote, CTO of IBM. You can reach out to any of us about this session via LinkedIn should you have any questions. Thanks again for watching.